So, hey friends, today's an interview episode and one I've been looking forward to a lot. I'm here with Jeff Slate, who is an ASCAP-award-winning singer-songwriter from New York City, has fronted several bands, including the 80s mod punk band, the Mindless Thinkers, which is a great name, by the way, has worked with musicians such as Earl and Carlos Alomar, has opened for Sheryl Crow, toured and lived in Europe, and has released numerous albums, both as part of different bands and as a solo artist. He's also a prolific journalist, writing for publications such as Rolling Stone, The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, and Esquire, and has interviewed or written about artists as varied as Bob Dylan, Bob Geldof, David Bowie, Willie Nelson, and of course, Tom Petty. Jeff's a lifelong fan of music and of musicians, and is a huge admirer of Tom's work, which is why I'm most delighted to have him on the show. Thank you so much for joining me, Jeff. How are you?
I now have to live up to that introduction. I will. I'm already going to take a left turn. The Mindless Thinkers I was in a band in my first band, which became the Mindless Thinkers, in about 83, 84. And we went to see Checkered Past, and Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols was the guitar player. I'd already seen him one time with the Professionals at that point, but never with the Pistols. And he was drunk, and we met him and asked him for a name because we had a terrible name, which I won't disclose. And we needed a good name. And we went backstage after the show, and he and Nigel Olsson from Blondie, I think it was, maybe Klemberg, said, you guys are the Mindless Thinkers. And wow. I just thought I'm still friends with Jonesy to this day, which is great and amazing and weird. But and he has obviously it was a low point in his life, but he has no recollection of that. But he will take credit for the name. It's a pretty fucking good punk name.
It's a great name. It really is, right? Yeah. I love it. And a good backstory too, right?
We're coming up on our 40th anniversary, and we're going to release the album and a couple of singles that never got released because we broke up. So there's actually Mindless Thinkers content coming in 2024 if you can wait.
Man,
I know, is that crazy?
That must be a lot of fun to go back and look at that stuff again, hey? Through a lens.
It's not at all. It's like we did one reunion show, so we never played together after about 85 or 6. We did one reunion show when the Clash were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. CBGB's threw a big bash for them, and we headlined that and reunited, played some Clash stuff, played our own stuff. And I've had this, I'll name drop, I've had this conversation many times with Paul Weller, who I'm sure you're aware of.
Absolutely.
Who doesn't really know Tom's work. I will say this. I once asked him, because I'm friends with Ben Munt, something about Ben Munt. He's like, who's that? And I'm like, oh my God, how do you not know who Ben Munt is? But anyway, so I schooled him. But anyway, and we talked about like having to try to sing the songs you wrote when you were like 16, 17, 18 years old. His songs, of course, changed the world. Mine were just bad. But, you still have to find your way in. And that's why he doesn't do it. And I totally get it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah.
Eating Rifles and Tube Station. Well, maybe not Tube, but Going Underground, and those things, they're evergreen. But I get why he doesn't want to play them.
Yeah. So I wanted to read the opening paragraph back to you of the article that you wrote for Esquire after Tom had passed away. I think it's a really good jumping off point to talk about some of this stuff. So you said, sure. Tom Petty never felt above us. The hit records and sold out tours never stopped, and he counted Bob Dylan, George Harrison, Johnny Cash, and so many more legends among his friends. Yet he still felt down to earth. It was as though he was our representative among those storied artists, like a fan had snuck in and grabbed the last seat at the table with the big boys. And now he's gone. And so that jumping off point is, those 4 words must have been really heavy to write. So I wanted to ask you about the process of having to put that article together about an artist that you loved, and what did that bring up as you were writing that article?
Well, a lot of times you'll have obituaries already written, for artists that are, you just do, and then you sort of edit them for the moment. That was not one I had. I started getting text messages from a couple of the band members at some point. There's my dog. At some point in the afternoon, that there was there was something going on.
Yeah.
That they were gathering at the hospital, that it was, and, part of me was just a friend, and part of me was a journalist. Like, this is a really big story, and I need to be prepared for this.
Yeah.
So I said to one of the guys, look, I'm going to need to because the news had sort of broken. I think it broke that he died, but then he wasn't dead. That was sort of the initial news report. And so I contacted my editor at Esquire, and I said, look, I don't know what you have in mind, but I really want to write this. This is got me written all over.
Yeah.
And he was like, we wouldn't have anybody else do it. So I had about an hour, and right, maybe an hour and a half. But, in the meantime, I was getting messages from a couple of the guys, and it was, it was pretty grim. And I had to not report anything that was told to me as a friend or in confidence, although they were details I'm sure everybody would have wanted to know at the time, that everybody was there, that they were, that there were, just things happening. And so I just sat down, and the article that you read the introduction to is exactly what came out. I mean, it just sort of came out in almost one pass, which never happens. It's like a great song or a great, and, little editing here and there for accuracy, some things, Bob Dylan's comment came in, and it was funny because his manager contacted me because whoever quoted it first, I think Rolling Stone, got it wrong. Right. And he was very upset that he got it wrong. So, he's like, please get it right. Bob wants it to be right. I'm like, okay. And it went up, and then at some point that evening, I went back and read it. Yeah. Because I was like, what the fuck just happened? And all the news was breaking, and it was awful. And I read it as if I hadn't written it. I read it as a fan reading it, I think. And I was like, oh my God, that is exactly the piece. That is exactly what I would have wanted to say. Oh my God, I said it, And I will tell you, many people have pointed to that piece in the years since Tom passed. People who were close to him, people who didn't know him at all, who were just fans, even like casual fans, like really casual fans, like, I've got the greatest hits, and like, okay. There was something about that piece, but I'll tell you, I think it was the next day, might have been 2 days, but I'm pretty sure it was the next day. I got a text message from his manager, Tony Dimitriadis, at the time, thanking me, for like, I'm going to get emotional, but writing such a great piece that really captured who Tom was, and not betraying any of the things that I had seen or was privy to when he was around, and that I was lucky enough to be a fly on the wall for when I didn't have my journalist hat on. He may not have said that then. He might have said that to me later when I saw him. But anyway, the gist was, thank you. And it made it very real, because here's a guy who's clearly grieving and also has to deal with the monumental task of dealing with the aftermath of it, not just, burying Tom and dealing with that, but the business of Tom Petty.
Of course.
And he took, a minute out to write to me. And I just thought, first of all, class act. And that's always my experience with Tom and everybody around him. But it really meant a lot. I mean, it really meant a lot. I'm sure I've told that story before. I hope he isn't upset that I said he wrote to me. I try to be judicious in the things that I share about my relationships within the band. But there have been times when people share it, or people write to me, or people like you ask me about it. And, it's always amazing to me that I was able to do justice to somebody who had been so important in my life for so long.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, there were 2016, 17, 15, 16, 17, 18, I wrote a lot of obituaries, like a lot of obituaries.
Yeah.
Way too many. And some of them I'm very, very proud of. And some of them I go back to and I'm like, yeah, that wasn't great. People like them. They're meaningful to people. I did one about Prince that I'm pretty proud of. Merle Haggard. There were a few others that I was really, that meant a lot. But there were just as many. Little Richard and Chuck Berry were two that. I did one for Chuck's 90th, and then a couple months later when he died. Those are all super meaningful to me. But a lot of them, they were assignments, and they were, I said what I had to say, and they were meaningful to me, but I didn't capture, what I really feel like is the essence of the person that I was so lucky to cross paths with a couple of times. And that's, I think, when we were all grieving in that moment collectively, people just wanted a little piece of Tom.
Yes.
And I think that article, even now, has just a little bit of him, because I got to, I hang out with the guy and watch him at close range too a bunch of times. And so so thanks for bringing that up, and you upset me now, and I'm done. No, no, I mean that sincerely. It's very emotional to think back on that day and that piece, and
it absolutely isn't. I was going to say, because it's funny, because when you'd reached out to me, to talk about whether to jump on the podcast and whatnot, I'd read that. I went back and did some research, obviously, and looked, and I found that article, and I was like, that's the article that I read. That is the first article that I read once we found out and once we knew for sure. And it was the same
kind
thing.
Of everywhere. That piece was kind of everywhere.
But and I think the reason for that is because it's obviously a good piece of journalism in it captures everything you need to say about the passing of a beloved artist. But as you say, it's got, and now that you said that you wrote it sort of almost in one pass, it has that sort of very personal feel where you're telling someone about this person who's died, rather than it being, and then they did this on this day, and then they did this on this day. It's got that real
I hate those. I don't feel like, and I've lobbied many times when I've had to do these things, especially when they're artists that I've crossed paths with, that whoever I'm writing it for allows me to do that. Because I think, you can get a good obituary, the New York Times or the LA Times, or, wherever, the Guardian, whatever, they're gonna give you the facts of the person's life. And everybody wants to be reminded of those facts, but I think that's not what we're looking for when it's somebody who, we did feel like we knew this guy.
Yeah.
I mean, he did let us in a way that is unique, certainly among his peers.
Very uncommon, yeah, for sure. Well, let's use that then as a sort of a gateway into then talk about, how did you come across Tom Petty's music? Do you remember your first exposure to it? Do you remember sort of the first time you thought, wait a minute, this guy is not just the next rock and roller, this guy's something a bit different?
I do. It was funny because I was born in 67. So 76, 77, when the first couple of records came out, I was a little too young, but I had a friend who had a huge family and older brothers. And one of the older brothers had the first two records. And I remember, we snuck him out when he was out one Friday night. We were playing them. And, you have to remember, at that time, AM radio was like, first of all, you could hear a lot of different styles on AM radio. And it was just, so preeminent in America at that time that, you would hear Tom Petty and Fleetwood Mac, and you would also hear, and the Knack, and, whoever else was out at the time, but you would also hear like Debbie Boone and Elvis and Donna Summer and, Elton John. Everybody was on the radio all together.
Yeah.
So those first two records, part of it's the production. They're a little rough and ready, but part of it is too, they just felt like records of the time. American Girl stood out. Mm-hmm. Breakdown stood out. Listen to Her Heart stood out. I remember those. So I remember not long after that, Dan the Torpedoes came out, and that was like, whoa, there's something completely else going on here, because most albums around that time were 1 or 2 singles and 8 or 9 B-sides, basically. Yep. And this was an album that even the stuff that, like Louisiana Rain or whatever, that certainly wasn't a single, was like really interesting.
Yes.
And it sounded amazing. The playing was great. His voice is so expressive and unique. I mean, nobody else sounds like Tom Petty. And I think that was, by that time, he and the band had all found their roles within Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. So, but the songs, ultimately, it wasn't just, like I said, American Girl, Breakdown, Listen to Her Heart. Well, my band plays those songs still to this day. They're great songs. But, Dan the Torpedoes was like a whole other level of songwriting and production and musicianship. And then not too long after that, and he was everywhere too.
Yes.
You got to remember, it was like Rolling Stone and Circus and Cream and Hit Parader, and he was really everywhere. He was the guy who was, and he was a really, he looked different than everybody else, And then when Hard Promises came out, which obviously, and Stop Dragon was on the radio with Stevie Nicks and The Insider, it was like, he had catapulted into this world of stardom all of a sudden. Yep. He was on, the Friday night video shows, and this is pre-MTV, and, the in-concert shows. I mean, he was sort of everywhere.
Right.
And I remember there was an article about him in like my local newspaper, not in Rolling Stone or not in, but just in something that, the guy had gone to see Tom Petty or interview Tom Petty. I don't remember exactly, but it's like, whoa, that's a whole other level of coverage. Yeah. In the pre-internet day that really, so it was this sort of slow burn. And then I didn't get to see him. I did see, around that same time, I got to see the Kinks and the Who and the Clash a bunch of times. And, all of those things, but particularly the Clash, changed my life. But, a lot of those were because I had an older brother and an older sister who would take me to these shows. Yeah. Tom Petty was not on their radar. I mean, the Kinks and the Who were certainly on their radar, the Stones too. But the Clash, because they shut down Times Square. My sister lived in Times Square, and she was like, "The fuck's going on here? Do you know these guys? We should go." I'm like, "Yes, we should go." Anyway, because I was a young guy, but I didn't get to see Tom until the summer of '86 with Bob Dylan at Madison Square Garden. And it was funny because it was in the summertime. I had tried to get tickets, or I just missed out getting tickets back in the day when we had to like wait out, in front of Ticketmaster at Tower Records, actually, here in New York, and get tickets. I didn't get tickets. I was in the middle of finals or something, so I had to scalp tickets. And then because it was in the middle of the summer and I was at NYU at the time, nobody was around and nobody wanted to go. It was the weirdest thing, because Bob was in a place where, I think he was seen as a little bit done, maybe, at that point. And he'd had uneven shows for a number of years at that point. So people were a little like, and certainly young people my age were, I was 19, were not super into him. And I have to say, people will take issue with this, but Tom was kind of seen similarly, right. That he wasn't, he'd had Long After Dark had certainly made an impact with MTV, but this was before he went on the sort of, rocket ride that became the next 5 years with the Wilburys and Full Moon Fever and all that. Yep. This was sort of the calm before the storm, and the band was in a rough place too, we all know now. So it was weird. I could not get anybody to go. And so I scalped the ticket, and obviously the guy who I scalped it to out in front had to sit with me. So, we met up again inside. He turned out to be, was a really interesting dude. He was like a Vietnam vet. He'd seen Dylan with the band at Madison Square Garden. So he was telling me about that. He didn't really know Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And when they came out, he was really into it. And we were like, blown away. Bob did a set all by himself. Whatever people tell you, it was fucking amazing. And Tom and the Heartbreakers did a set pretty long that I remember. They did like a 15-minute version of Breakdown. It's ridiculous. But anyway, they and this guy who didn't know anything about them was like an instant fan. This, to him, this was like the essence of rock and roll.
Yeah.
That you could subordinate yourself to the star and just be this great band, but then when your time came to elevate things to the point that you would impress this guy who'd never heard any of those songs or claimed not to,
Yeah.
And they didn't do, it was funny, they did Breakdown, but I don't remember them doing like hits. I think they did, and I think I said this to somebody the other day, I think Stan sang a song. I think they did one of like Nervous Reaction or one of, it was
a cover,
weird.
yeah,
or
weird.
I could be wrong. The train spotters out there will kind of be like, oh no, this is the set list from that night. I'm like, I'm doing this from memory. So, and so that was the first time I had seen them, and then after that, I didn't miss them very much. I did not go to the Southern Accents tour. I was a little put off by the Confederate flag drama.
Yeah.
Even then, but then. Into the Great Wide Open tour. I saw him a couple of times then, many times over the years. And then, later on, I got to know Tom and everybody and got to, stand at the soundboard and stand on the stage and all those things that are your dream when you're, a fan as a kid.
Of course.
Which I'm sure we'll get into. But that was sort of the gateway. The gateway drug was, like many people, the older brother who had the first couple of records. We squirreled them away and listened to them, probably ruined them, scratched them up. And they were, they were good, but I remember this really vividly. Like, I wasn't like, oh my God, this guy's the next, next rock and roll star. It was Damn the Torpedoes, where it was like the minute you put it down on side one, it transported you in a way that was unlike really anything else that year. There were other great records that year, but this was like, it had so much going for it. So, can't really understate how great that record was.
Oh, and so I went through that exact point with, there were actually a lot of really good albums released in 81 and huge albums.
Well, that was 79, right? So 81
sorry, 81. Sorry, I'm sorry. Yeah, 79, not 81, 79, yeah. And so when you look back and you think that Damn the Torpedoes actually stands up against all of them still, it's like, yeah, no, there's some quality there. And I was...
The Wall and London Calling, and it was
exactly.
Really... Yeah.
It was some huge albums, and a good time for music too, right? I think it was when rock and roll was starting to pick up again and diversify a little bit, so it wasn't all just sounding the same. Like, you did have a bit of diversity coming in now, and we're just going through.
And the great thing, I will say this, which is really important. Certainly, The Wall and Tusk were big albums that we can appreciate after the fact as being, certainly Tusk being really special and unique. But, at the time, those were not, they just didn't move me. But yes. London Calling and Damn the Torpedoes really, changed my life, both of them in so many ways. But I will say it was the last moment where there were, it was 4 or 5 guys standing in a room playing instruments, just getting the best take they could possibly get with a really great producer, so that, within just a couple of years, we were in synthesizer land and drum machine land. And that's a whole, and Tom, certainly, the great thing about his records is they stand up, they don't sound super dated, because it was also guys playing instruments around those machines.
Yeah.
But everybody fell into that hole. All the 60s guys fell into the synthesizer hole and made some terrible records. And, it's not to say the songs weren't there, but I remember when Keith Richards put out Talk Is Cheap, it was like, oh my God, thank God somebody put out a record with people playing instruments for a change. And that was like 10 years later. So anyway, go ahead.
That's so funny. I was just thinking back, like, you've a couple of things that I pick up on. one thing is, you've said a couple of times now, and I totally agree, and I get, this is one of my hobby horses. People forget how great a band the Heartbreakers were. I mean, everyone knows that Tom Petty's one of the greatest songwriters of all time, but people forget how tight of a band they are. And when you see them go play with Dylan, you cannot back Bob Dylan unless you've got really serious chops and be able to nimble and change on the fly, because he's going to go in left direction, right. He's going to change, right? He's going to change the set list on a whim. So to be able to respond to
and
that,
the key,
you've got to
I mean, both Benmont and Mike. So I wrote a piece for the Bob Dylan Center. They're putting out a book for people who visit the Dylan Center out in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I chose to write about the Heartbreakers tour.
Sweet.
And Band of the Hand, because I got to see Bob's original lyrics for Band of the Hand, which is a song they cut when they were in Australia that Tom produced. And, you know, they both talk about it as this really mind-blowing experience. I mean, you know, Benmont is a huge, huge Bob Dylan fan and doesn't hide that, and doesn't hide it around Bob. But, you know, he was sort of the MD because he would always have to hold it together. If Bob said, I want to do, you know, I don't know, you know, to Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll in E flat. Everybody would look at Benmont and be like, and he'd be like, okay, we're going to do this now. You know, there's very few bands that can pull that off. And I will say this, I'm a Rock Hall voter. And I think it's a shame that the E Street Band, who, and I'm going to piss people off and this will make you headlines, I think they are a far inferior band to the Heartbreakers. And they are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a band.
Yes.
The E Street Band, which is ridiculous. First of all, they're not a band. I mean, they're just Bruce Springsteen's backing band. Whereas the Heartbreakers have backed up, like you said, Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan and all these other people as a band. Yes. I mean, they elevated that Unchained record beyond belief for Johnny Cash. It was Tom's favorite Heartbreakers record, you know, so that's how great it was. So for them not to be in there as a band, also a separate entity, if you're going to put in a band like the E Street Band, which is a novelty at best to have them in as a band. No, I mean, seriously, they are not, nobody goes to see the E Street Band. They go to see Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. No disrespect to those players, you know, but and there's not one of them in that band except maybe Roy Bittan who can hold a candle to the players in the Heartbreakers. I mean, the Heartbreakers, every single one of them has something really, really special. And even, you know, the replacements or the additions, you get into Ferroni or Ron and Howie and back to Ron and Scotty Thurston. Everybody who was in that orbit was just spectacular at what they needed to do.
And again, almost like, you know, if you go back to someone like Zeppelin or Rush, they're not only brilliant players individually, but they've got that little bit of magic where they fit. You know, they're exactly the right people in the right room.
And I think that's what's remarkable about it. I've talked to Ron in particular about this. You know, how do they fucking find each other? I mean, that's just the sort of existential question of how these guys just sort of came together and stayed together, that it stuck.
You know, you do get that sense of sort of, it's us against them. And some of it was sort of, you know, some of it's just that young person's kind of the life's got me down and we'd come from nothing. But some of it was real, like the record company's trying to put the price up, or, you know, they've sold your catalog and now you're on this different label that we didn't agree to. So that sort of, I think that early strife probably brought them together a little bit, you know, and then there's just that general sort of sense of, well, we like each other musically and respect each other.
I think so. The difficulty is then it eventually becomes, in any band, us against us. And, you know, anybody who's been on the road for any length of time knows that even people who get along really well, when you're in a bus together, a van together, or, you know, flying together or whatever, you hate the people you're traveling with after, you know,
of course.
It doesn't even take that long, you know. I've done relatively short tours and wanted it to be over. So, but they kept it together, and that's amazing.
Well, I also think that speaks a lot to another thing that I think is sometimes underappreciated with Tom and the boys is that professionalism. You know, we've got to be on our game for the fans. So even if you're the last person I want to look at tonight, I still got to work with you. I've still got to be able to get through. I might not talk to you for the rest of the tour, but we got to do that because that's our job. That's what we do for our fans.
And right? I think that really speaks to the fact that all of them individually, the one thing I've noticed, all of them love talking about is the music they love.
Yes.
You know, I mean, you know, so the elephant in the room is that I did get to meet Tom a couple of times and just sort of be around him a couple of times. But the one time I had like a really long conversation with him, I just figured, hey, this is the last time I'm gonna, you know, we talked for a while and it was really nice and, you know, it was very relaxed. It wasn't a public setting. It was very chilled out. It was in a recording studio.
Okay.
And I thought, okay, well, we've been talking for a while, like 20 minutes. A pretty long time.
That's nice, yeah.
This is probably the last time I'm ever going to talk to him. I'm just going to say it. So it's Bob Dylan really like, you know, and, right? and then I subsequently asked about George. I asked about Roy Orbison, you know. And the funny thing was, you know, Bobby was a little guarded because Bob's still alive. George was, I want to say, yeah, George was dead at the time. So it was, you know, and not that long, it was fairly recent. So it was, you know, he was a little circumspect. Mm-hmm. But Roy, he just lit up about Roy.
Yeah.
Because he's a fan.
But he was the hero. I mean, Orbison was the one, right? He was the hero of all the guys in the room. They'd just sit around and after they finished recording with the Wilburys, now tell us about Elvis. Tell us about hanging out with Elvis. You know, like little kids, like us, like fans.
Right. And I think that's the thing he never lost is when the stuff we talked about, when he was able to drop his persona and just be a fan, it was really genuine. And I look, you know, I still, you know, I talk to Ben Monk really regularly, and we talk about the music we're listening to and the stuff that turns us on and the people we like. And a lot of times it's, you know, it's not even recent artists typically. And you know, I haven't talked to Mike in a while, but I bought some road cases from Mike Campbell a couple of years ago, and we were on the phone, and he had just played with the Reunited Birds with Marty Stewart. It was McGuinn and Hillman and whatever.
Yeah.
And you know, I know those guys. He knows those guys, obviously a lot better than me. But and we were gossiping, you know, like as two fans who, you know, have had a little bit of window into these people's lives. We were just gossiping the way fans do about why can't they get together with David and but you know this whole thing, right? Why can't they bury the hatchet? You know, and because we both have a little bit of inside knowledge too. It's like, oh yeah, that's totally true, and you know, it's really funny, but that just goes to show how deep the love of all those artists is. It's like he knows the guitars they used and the studios they used and the mics they used and the, you know, they're nerds just like we are about those things.
But I think that's the thing with
it's beautiful.
It's the thing with musicians generally though too, right? Like I don't know any of my musician friends. What we want to do is we want to sit around, crack a beer, and just talk about music. Just endlessly, and we could have the same conversation 15 times, but we just love having that conversation. I think that, you know, you think about Mike Campbell, who not only was in, I always think about this, okay, he's played with Johnny Cash, and he's played with Bob Dylan, he's played with all these artists, and he wrote for Don Henley, and he did all the oh, and he was in the fucking Heartbreakers. Like, you forget that. No, that's as important or more important to Mike Campbell as anything else. So when you're talking about sort of the relationships that you've built up with the Heartbreakers, how did that kind of start? Was that just through writing, or was that through sort of being around the scene, or?
Yeah, it's good question. I got to know Benmont first.
Okay.
We were introduced by a mutual friend, musician, and you know, we just hit it off. Yeah. We like a lot of the same stuff. We love Bob. You know, we could talk for hours about Bob Dylan. I mean, just, you know, just Bob Dylan. But you know, it's funny too. It's like we were all at that event where Tom was, and there was no seat next to Tom.
Okay.
And nobody in the band wanted to sit next to Tom. You don't want to sit next to the boss if you're like, you know. So they were all like, I remember Ron like, whatever. And I sat next to Tom for that. And I think part of it was like, if this guy can tolerate, because it was like an hour and a half we were sitting there. It was a little bit trial by fire. Like, you're okay if you can keep your shit together.
Yeah.
And also, have a normal conversation with this guy who's clearly like the biggest presence in the room.
Yes.
And I will say Dr. John was there too. So there was a lot going on. And I know it's crazy.
Wow.
It's a crazy, crazy night. And so I think, people suss you out there. They're like, oh, this guy's okay. And I had already met Ben and we had struck up a relationship. And then, things just sort of happened. When they'd come to town, I'd go and hang out, and Ben and I would usually spend the afternoon together, and then we'd go up to the garden or wherever they were playing. I'd hang out. I got to know all the crew, and I got to know all the crew is really the key. I got to know Bob Scoville really, really well, who did front of house for them for many, many years. And Greg Looper, the late Greg Looper, who was one of the greatest guys in the world. And I mean, like when we did our Tom Petty tribute in LA for Music Cares a couple of years ago before the pandemic, I had Greg Looper do monitors and I had Bob Scoville do front of house. Wow. We had Ron on bass and Ferroni on drums and Jim Keltner. Yeah. And it was like, Ben couldn't do it and Mike didn't want to do it. But when I told him we got Earl Slick, who's, my compadre in a lot of musical things, he was really excited because it wasn't somebody who was just going to come in and cop his parts. He was going to do his own thing. Yeah. He wasn't going to play the Mike Campbell parts. He was going to play the guitar. So, but it was really important to me to have people who were part of Tom's world to be part of that event. Because by that time, those are guys I'd known for almost 20 years. It's weird to think that, and like, when they come through town with other things, Chinners come to my shows. And when I bought Mike's road case, I had to go up to the garden. I had to wheel a road case down 6th Avenue. It's crazy. It's like the things that have happened as being part of that world that are really strange and beautiful. Yeah. Because every single person in and around Tom's orbit were just first class people, from like, management, the people in the office, all the way down to every single person on the crew. If you had been sort of tapped as this guy's okay, there wasn't one person who ever gave you attitude, who ever asked you why you were there, whoever, if it had been like okayed, you were part of the family. Yeah. And once they knew your face, you were always part of the family. People who had no right remembering my name would remember my name, which just blows my fucking mind.
But that comes from the top, though, right? That's where that example is set at the top. And it trickles down, and everything else gets weeded out. And I love that you sort of. I always love it when I'm talking to people who have this connection to the band, and you throw out little things like, "Oh yeah, me and Ben would hang out in the afternoon, then we just walk over to Madison Square Garden," as if that's just something that But I'd like to ask you: Is Ben Mon as intense as he sometimes seems? And it's because he always seems like he's very in the moment all the time, like he's just living every single second as hard as he can. I love that about him.
He's very intense. It's what's really special and beautiful about him. He cares really, really passionately about the music he makes. He doesn't take any of that for granted. He doesn't this is a guy who still to this day practices all the fucking time. I feel bad because I go, between shows or tours or whatever, I can go like a really long time without picking up a guitar. He plays piano every day. I'm like, stop that. You're making us all feel bad. I mean, he's really intense about it. He's making a record and we talk about it, and he's still working on the running order and the mixes and the mastering, and it's like, oh my God, and part of that is the artistic temperament. We don't want to let things go, but he is exactly that. But that's also what makes him so unique and special. Of course, he's, they all filled a role in in that band. And I think that's part of why, he's probably the sweetest of the guys.
Right.
He's a curmudgeon, like, many musicians are, but he also has this sweetness about him that, we still to this day will talk about things, and Tom will come up and he gets really quiet, and he's still really, really affected by that loss. And I'm not betraying anything by telling you that. I think he wears that on his sleeve. He really feels that loss. You have to remember, this is a guy he knew from the time he was like 13.
Yes.
He was a kid.
Yeah.
And,
and a guy he looked up to too, right? I mean, you can be a bandmate, and you can still. I look up to my friends, right? You can be friends and close to someone, and still have a lot of admiration for them, and that definitely comes across when any of them.
You can be in a band and be angry at the guy as a person or whatever, but there's no denying, and he has said this to me, when Tom would bring in songs, I remember when we were talking about the Wildflowers documentary, he was trying to remember a scene in the film, how it happened in real life. And, he said, when Tom would bring in these songs, and you don't always remember the details of every single one because there were so many.
Yeah.
But he said every time it was like Christmas, as a the guy who was able to write the parts to hopefully elevate those songs that were already perfect, special, just as little demos, he said that is like, that's the thing that any musician would die for, to be able to have that seat at the table.
Of course.
So,
and be involved as an equal too, because I think that's the other thing that Tom had creative control, and he was the band leader and he was the face of the organization. But you watch the Wildflowers documentary, or you watch Running Down a Dream, or you sort of listen to the interviews with the bands. Going back to it was a band. So Benmont, like, what do you think? What do we need here? What do we need? Play that? Yeah, that's okay. That's good. Or but it was it was a collaborative process. You got to remember,
right? They trusted each other.
Yes, of course. Which you have to at that level.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the reason. You can talk about the disintegration of the relationship between Stan and Tom, which is tragic because Stan was the drummer. I mean, he was the heart. And I played with Frony. Steve's a great friend of mine, and I love Steve to bits. But for me, as an OG fan, Stan is the drummer. Yeah. And I think you can be on tour with somebody and hate their guts, and when the tour is over, never want to see them again. But you will, because it's for the band, for the greater good. I think ultimately, if that trust breaks down, that sort of indescribable thing, that sort of otherworldly thing, if that breaks down, then it's almost impossible to get that back.
Yeah, for sure. And they had it in spades. And like you said, I mean, it was a little bit of serendipity, a little bit of common sense, and Tom walking into that room where Benmont's got people over recording, thinking, wait a minute, these guys sound pretty good. I could definitely latch onto this. It's just a little bit of time and a little bit of luck. But I think, as we said, like that sort of that desire to stay together and get through. It's like a marriage, right? I mean, I've been married for 25 years next year, and we've had some days where I'm like, I'm gonna go somewhere else because I don't need to be here right now.
A really long
right?
time.
It's a long time. So.
I'm suspicious of you.
Again, it comes back somewhat to what I was talking about earlier about professionalism, and I know that Tom, every band, every young guy starts a band, you're at least one eye on thinking, well, might get me laid here and there. But Tom and Mike and Benmont, and especially like, as you're talking about Benmont, the way how seriously he takes music, that's definitely secondary. The music's got to be right first. So, they had that rule, no girls on the bus early on, which, Kiss sure shit wouldn't have had that rule. Van Halen wouldn't have had that rule. The Stones certainly wouldn't, you know what I mean? But that sort of that dedication to, yes, we're going to go and have fun, but, and they said they never played drunk. Obviously there's some issues around Southern accents and that kind of time, but they didn't play that. They take that seriously. This is our time to be serious. When we're not on stage, that's when we can party. This has to be right, and we have to take this seriously. And I just, again, that's something that, as a nerd and as sort of a square, but as someone who's very process oriented, I like that, and I find that endearing, and I find that rock and roll. That's, to me, that's rock and roll. It's like, yeah, go out there and play. That's what it's supposed to be about, the music.
Well, I think one of the things that people don't don't talk about all that much is it's a lot of hard work. I mean, I think it was Dizzy Gillespie who said, it's not the hour and a half you're on stage, it's the 22 and a half you're doing everything else. You're traveling and you're dealing with the tickets people and the hall and the sound check and the travel and the shitty food and it's all that. That's what it's about. The 90 minutes is the joy, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's about, I mean, they were always serious about doing the best job they could possibly do. And you can see when they slipped a little bit, the quality control slipped a little bit, or
100%.
the relationships within the band slipped a little bit, or, whatever. So,
yeah. So one of my favorite aphorisms is, take what you do seriously, never take yourself seriously. And I think that's a fairly, if you can get that balance, that's a good life. And again, Tom's the epitome of that, right? I think he always had that. He always struck me as, and Benmont too, apart from being very intense, they all seem like they got a good sense of humor. Like they like to laugh, not everyone does,
Yeah.
I think I like that. So, what we should do? I wanted to talk to you quickly because it was something that came up earlier. And it's something that, again, it's another sort of bee in my bonnet that I always have, that I think that Tom Petty is possibly one of, if not one of, maybe the most underrated vocalists, rock and roll vocalists of all time. Because again, everyone knows he's a great songwriter, brilliant rhythm guitarist, good bass, solid bass player, solid drummer, great.
Yeah.
But as a singer, I mean, if you listen to songs like Refugee, and then you listen to something like A Woman in Love, It's Not Me from Hard Promises, and then you listen to US 41, and then you listen to it's not the same singer. It almost feels like it's not the same guy, because he had that ability to bend his voice into the shape of whatever song he was working on. It's absolutely amazing. It blows my mind every time I listen to those records.
I think, because he wrote characters.
Yeah.
People don't think of him in the same breath as like Bowie, who was always, who wrote from the perspective of characters because he wasn't really comfortable with being, he took on a name rather than be Davy Jones, right?
Yeah.
I think Tom was similar, and I think he inhabited those characters. And look, George Harrison said many times in many interviews that the thing that first drew him to Tom was his voice.
Right.
The storytelling.
Yeah.
And he would know a good voice. He was around a few, saw a few good singers in his day. And I think, you got to remember too, he was in the Wilburys. Those are all guys who, whether you like, look, I'm a real advocate of Bob Dylan's voice. George is a great singer. Roy is just, the epitome.
Yeah.
And Jeff Lynne has just a beautiful voice and a beautiful range. All of them, though, have so much emotion and there's so much storytelling in their voices.
Yeah.
I think that's what elevates. It's like, you can have a great song. It can be a Bob Dylan song for that matter. But if you put it in the hands of one of those guys, it's just, I remember Tom did tell me this story when I asked him about Roy. He said they were sitting on the couch in the studio and Roy was just rehearsing his part, because George would have them all do it and kind of audition them to be there. And he was just in this little quiet, like not his full voice, but he's like, just kind of singing the quiet. And he was like, I can't compete with that. Right? But that's not true either. He couldn't do what Roy did, but he did what he did. And what he did was no less special or unique.
It's also important to note, though, that Orbison couldn't do what Petty did. He couldn't sing some of the songs that Tom Petty sang the way he sang them because they're totally different.
Totally different.
And most people can't. And, in Paul Zollo's book, he says...
I would take issue with that. I think Roy could. He just didn't choose to.
Well, maybe. But,
he had a very distinct brand.
Yeah, but intonation and phrasing is very important. It's same as tremolo with a guitarist, right? Stevie Ray Vaughan sounds like Stevie Ray Vaughan because he bends the strings a certain way and no one else does it that way. Right. Roy Orbison sounds like Roy Orbison because that's how he sings, and it's your trademark, it's your fingerprint, right? As an artist, is the way you sound. And of course, when you bring all those pieces in the Wilburys, like, my God, and I was thinking back now, before I knew who Tom Petty was, really, I always thought, well, you got Jeff Lynne, who I knew because I'm English and I know yellow, obviously. Roy Orbison, you've got the guy from the Beatles, that little fella from the Beatles, and you've got Bob Dylan. Well, how's Tom Petty broke into this group? That was when I sort of first started listening. That's kind of weird that they'd let this junior member in, but then when you dig in, it's like, no, they all admired him just as much. When Dylan leans over to Tom and says, when George Harrison just leaves the room, he says, he was in the Beatles. So that sort of admiration just goes across all lines, right? It's not. Yes, it's Bob Dylan, but he's still just a musician. Yes, it's George Harrison, but he's still just enjoys playing his ukulele with Tom Petty,
Yeah.
So I love that about him. And on to that, so just very quickly then, just wanted to talk about sort of in terms of music and as a musician yourself, do you think that what's the sort of what would you define as the signature sound of the Heartbreakers? What makes a Heartbreakers song that makes it different to other bands? Like you said, like E Street Band. You could have the E Street Band could play, I don't know, The Waiting, and it wouldn't have the same groove to it. You could have, I don't know, Billy Joel could play Room at the Top maybe, but it wouldn't have the
really
same soul.
Me. Okay.
Right, but you see what I'm going with, where I'm going with that, though. Like big names who people really respect, but they don't have that same. But there's something about the Heartbreakers. It's not just Tom's voice. There's something about the way Mike and Tom play together. There's something about the way the drums and the bass fit in around that. And then there's something about the way that Benmont knows exactly when to really lay into that Leslie or when to back right off and do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So is that as much as it is, just that sort of understanding, or do you think there's something?
Yeah,
okay,
you answer the question. No. Look, there's a certain alchemy in the way those guys play together, where, so here's a good example. When Stan left, I was very sad.
Yeah.
And Ben and I have talked about this. He loves Stan, and still to this day rues the day that relationship broke down.
Yeah.
And I kind of equated Ferroni with being kind of a session cat. I knew his history, but he did Clapton and Ziggy Marley and a lot of Average White Band, obviously, but he was a cat. And he had a very session guy sound to me on record. And so when we did the show at the El Rey on Tom's birthday a couple of years ago, I was standing in front of Ron on bass and Ferroni on drums. And I'll tell you two things. First of all, he's like a freight train behind you. And if you're Tom, you gotta love that.
Yeah.
I mean, you gotta love that. He also has that role that we were talking about earlier that, it would be hard to find. I mean, if they had used Dave Grohl, he doesn't have that role.
No, he doesn't. I'm a huge I'm going to jump in there. I'm a huge Foo Fighters fan. I've seen him 4 times. I love Dave Grohl. 100% not the right drummer for the Heartbreakers.
Not at all.
Absolutely not.
With
Ferroni, and do you think with Steve then, like you're talking about with that role?
But my point was,
sorry, go ahead.
Just those two guys.
Yeah. It
sounded like the Heartbreakers. I remember when we were in rehearsal and they were just kind of playing together, and it sounded like the Heartbreakers. It was like Slick and I were playing. There was a tune. We were in front of Keltner. And the minute he starts playing, it's very rare that a drummer sounds like a person, Yeah. But it sounded like Jim Keltner. It sounded like the Wilburys, you know? We were playing You Got It, and it sounded like You Got It because he played the fucking drums on You Got It. So, it was like, there is a certain magic to those people when you put them together.
Yeah.
That's the special sauce.
Well, and getting to, again, I've talked to Jake Thistle about this. He said the same thing, like just kind of looking over your shoulder and seeing Jim Keltner behind you. That's got to be a trip, man. That's just got to be a really weird, odd moment to like, oh, that's...
Yeah, I mean, I played with a lot of people, a lot of really special people. You wouldn't think it would be, I played Won't Get Fooled Again with Pete Townsend. It doesn't get...
What?
And I played...
Whoa. Let's not gloss over that.
Wait, and I played Knocking on Heaven's Door with McGuinn. So it's very hard to beat those moments. And yet playing with Keltner was a real highlight.
Yeah.
Yes, I did.
Would be for me too. I mean, well, I'm a hobbyist drummer myself, so. And again, I love Dave Grohl and I love Bonham, and of course you want those big powerful rock drummers, but it's when you try to play Steve Ferrone's lick from Fault Lines. You try to play that. You play that little bossa nova lick he's playing on the ride,
which we played with him.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy. And Keltner and these guys who, because they're session musicians, they're not just straight ahead rock drummers, and they have that role. They have that thing
Ron,
where
it was
they
funny
can swing it.
Ron put that on the set list, and I was like, "Oh my god, this is gonna be a train wreck. There's no way we're doing that." And right away at rehearsal, it sounded great. And you're right, it was the glue was Ferrone.
Yeah, such a good, and it's one of those things that again a rock drummer doesn't put that in. They don't put that little triplet on the ride. They just don't, right? And it's got that sort of samba bossa nova kind of feel to it. Yeah, it's awesome. All right, you know what I'm going to do, Mr. Slate, is I'm going to throw 10 quick fire questions at you, and they're quick fire in the sense of they're quick questions. There's not a lot of depth to questions, and there are a lot of yes and no. But if they spin out into longer answers, that's fine too.
Okay.
All right. So it's the worst question for any fan of any. It's like saying, "What's your favorite Dylan album? What's your favorite Kid? What's your favorite?" Do you have a favorite? If you had to pick one, what's your favorite Tom Petty album or Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers? Gun to your head.
I'm going to say Traveling Wilburys Volume 3.
Oh, okay. And Volume 2? Or 3, sorry. 3, right?
3.
So, yeah, but wow, okay. Interesting. So that's Cool Dry Places on that though too, right?
Yeah.
Cool Dry Places on that.
I feel like because Roy wasn't there and because Bob had to leave early, he basically did all his parts and then left because he was on tour. It was left to the three of them to finish it. And I feel like Tom's presence, because Jeff and George were sort of the producers, so it's easier to have the other guy do. I feel like his imprint is really there.
Totally agree. Yeah.
And it's not something I've heard a bajillion times.
Awesome. No, that's a great answer.
And any album that starts off with "She's My Baby" is okay.
Yeah, that's great, man. Talk about great lyrics.
I mean, I was going to say Wildflowers, but it's like, and you know what? Conversely, I was going to say Echo.
Yeah.
Which I think is a hugely underrated record, which I know Tom hated.
Yeah.
But it does have it did fall prey to the 70-minute album thing, and it does. It would have been better as like 50 minutes, and so I'm going to go with I'm going to go with it's so good. It's so good.
Yeah,
so good.
Awesome. Okay, and I think I probably can guess then the answer to the question too is Mudcrutch or Traveling Wilburys.
I never saw the Traveling Wilburys, so
well, no one did. They never toured, so
yeah, I know. So I saw Mudcrutch quite a few times,
yeah,
and got to hang out with them a lot. So I was back, as you probably have figured out. I was backstage when they rehearsed with McGuinn. That was like, I'm just glad there was a photo because people wouldn't believe it. I'm going to say the Wilburys because it's the fucking Wilburys.
When you get 5 for 1, right? You get 5 great artists for 1.
Well, look, when because I wrote the biography of Roy for his family, and that part of the book was probably my favorite part to work on.
Yeah.
I got to fact check some stuff with Jeff Lynne and Tom, and it was, and it came out after Tom was gone. But I remember sending a copy to Dana and to Tony, and they were both really, really into it. We're like, "Oh, he would love this,"
What's the book? I don't think I've seen that one.
The Authorized Roy Orbison.
Oh, I'm gonna have to look that up then. I'll get to pick that up for sure.
You do look that up.
So, if you could join the Heartbreakers, in any era of Heartbreakers, you could join the Heartbreakers on stage for one song. What would it be? And would you play and or sing? So we're going back in time. Everyone's still alive. Yeah.
Mary Jane.
Ah, okay.
I mean, with Stan.
Yeah.
No offense, because I played it with Steve. So that box is already checked. With absolutely with Stan and Howie. And no offense to Ron, who I also played the song with. And I play the fucking guitar and sing. We do the thing, I mean, there'd be a whole, and there's a natural harmony line for the parts you're not singing. So it's like, I'm all over it. Yeah.
So you would take the harmonies then? You'd sing the back, or would you sing lead and let Tom sing back?
No, we split it up.
Okay. Very magnanimous. Okay, who would be, any of you, you've seen Tom a lot of times opening, who would be your dream opening act at a Tom Petty concert? Who'd be the best person to want with the Heartbreakers? Maybe who you saw, or maybe who never did but should have done.
Probably Roy.
Oh no, that'd be cool, eh?
Right.
They could bring him out for a couple of Wilburys tunes.
Yeah,
that'd be pretty wicked.
Yeah. Roy looms large in my. I mean, that was how I got the job writing the book. I got to know his sons, particularly Alex.
Okay.
And he knew I was like, to find a guy my age who's like a really true blue Roy Orbison fan, who's also a rock writer, who, you know, they also got along with and they can trust with the project. I think, you know, I was sort of a needle in a haystack because I fucking love Roy, man.
Yeah. I mean, so I grew up with him, and I always just thought that, well, everyone loves Roy Orbison. And then you find out when you're a bit older that some people never even really heard of him, and everyone knows Pretty Woman, but they don't know who, you know what I mean? Like a certainly younger generation. So again, exposing my kids to that stuff as well. And then explaining to my daughter that, you know, Roy Orbison wrote songs very differently to a lot of other people. Some of them had no chorus. Some of them had two bridges. Some of them were B, A, B, 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 C. Like it was just, he wrote whatever he felt, and people forget that. People think he's just a Pretty Woman guy, right? You know, which is a great song, but
he broke all the rules of songwriting.
Absolutely, in very fun, interesting ways, and everyone should do that. And I try, but I can't do it. most of my sister. Hey, whoa! I was a keyboard player first. I only started playing 8 years ago.
Tap, boom, boom. Okay.
Number 5. Okay, who's your favorite band member other than Tom? And I think I probably know this one as well. So, from the way you've spoken about him.
They're all so.
I know these are horrible questions.
It is. I'm going to say Ben because he might see this. No. You know, and I think you're right. You talked about how Ben elevates the song from just being like a rock and roll tune to special. I mean, you know, no disrespect to Mike, and he may see this too, God knows. And I love him to bits. And he's one of the truly underrated, great rock and roll guitar players because he elevates every song he plays on.
Yeah.
He has a part, it's thought out. He's from that George Harrison school. You can hum his solos.
Yeah.
I mean, how many people can you say that about, right?
Yeah.
But if they didn't have Benmont, they would just be kind of rock and roll records.
Yeah.
He's the person who elevates them and makes them, you know, Heartbreakers records, you know, that gives it that special sauce.
Do you think that I looking back and going through, because I'm on Hard Promises now, so I've reviewed the first 3 albums, and there's a distinct shift when you get to Damn the Torpedoes, where it's almost like Jimmy Iovine says, why is that guy not higher in the mix on these records? He's part of your sound on stage. So it's almost like it's a palpable, we need that guy front and center on a lot more of this stuff because it adds so much more width to it. So I don't know if you've ever talked to Benmont about that, because that's an interesting idea. I wonder if that was actually the case.
I never really have it. And it's weird because I interviewed him when the Wildflowers died. I mean, that's weird. Interviewing a friend is always strange, but I interviewed him about the Wildflowers documentary, and we took a left turn into the catalog, and he just went through album by album.
Yeah.
Giving me his opinion on each of the albums. And I'm like, I got to use that someday, somewhere. Yeah. But it was like, oh, I guess this is what we're doing. Because there was no time. It wasn't like a regular interview. There was no time limit. We were just talking.
Yeah.
And I'll have to go back and get back to you on that. I'm sure he's aware that the sounds, you know, look, they became a band in that 2.5 years.
100%. Yeah.
So, you know, whether that was Iovine elevating him or it was just the way things were evolving within the unit. So
it's so stark though. It's such, like I said, it's such a contrast. It really is. I mean, it's very, very
well,
noticeable.
the sound of the third record is completely different.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
it's like they went from, you know, almost like demo sounding records to like big rumor sounding records, you know.
Well, having an engaged producer, because those first 2 records, I mean, Denny Cordell wasn't really there some of the times. You know, you've got the engineers doing some of the stuff, and all that's going on, and they're going into the studios. Yeah, exactly. So, of course, now you get Jimmy Iovine with his relentless work ethic comes in and becomes demanding. Of course, that's going to change it for the better. So, okay, your next question: Walls Circus or Walls number 3?
Circus.
Really? You know, it's funny. I wrote that question and I thought that almost everyone would say number 3 because that's my favorite version because it's the very acoustic stripped down, and almost everyone said Circus. Almost everyone. So what do you
It's
prefer
got
about
Lindsey
it?
Buckingham doing the backing vocals.
Fair enough, yeah.
It rocks and swings. It's a really cool pop record. I don't think it holds up. Like, I was obsessed with it when that record came out, and I don't think it holds up as well. And we all have a little bit of allegiance to the stripped down version, because now that he's gone, I mean, I've played that, live many, many, many times, and it, there's like nary a dry eye.
Yes.
Because we hear it differently now.
Yeah.
So it's a hard choice, but Circus is just great. It's like the last of those great pop rock records, like those AM friendly records. Yeah. Nobody makes songs like, it's a rock and roll band playing a pop tune. You don't get that anymore. You've got like sort of Katy Perry and Kanye and this other kind of thing going. Even the bands who are considered sort of poppy, Killers or Panic at the Disco or Foo Fighters or whatever, they're not making, like, Circus could have been on the charts in '65.
Yes, absolutely, yeah, totally agree. I totally agree. And I mean, I remember, I was fairly late to that song for some reason. I think one of the things was I didn't listen to She's the One because it had the word soundtrack in it. So for some reason I thought that, that's probably just like three.
You and everybody else, yeah.
Yeah, I probably thought it's about 2 or 3 Tom Petty songs and then a bunch of instrumental Michael Kamen stuff, right? And then came back to it and heard that song and that opening line, "Some days are diamonds, some days are rocks." Well, straight away I'm like, well, you've got me there.
You know what? One thing we didn't say, which I really want to say, is Tom is the master of the first line.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I'll go with you on this.
She's an American girl raised on promises. Holy shit. You don't need to do anything else after that.
Yeah. Again, see those fault lines laid out like landmines. Like, again, no one writes that. No one else writes that. I mean, Dylan had that same turn of phrase where he just brings something to you that was completely out of left field.
He was never focused on the first line the way Tom was focused on the first line.
Yeah.
Dylan will write 20 verses and narrow it down to 4 or 5, and it's just the arc of the story that he wants to tell. But Tom was like, he's going to get you.
Yeah. Your next question is, if you could pick any artist to cover any Tom Petty song, who would it be and what song would they cover? This has thrown up some really good answers so far.
That's good. That's a good question. Maybe Regina Spektor or Rina Sawayama or somebody like that, sort of like reinvent it.
Yeah. 100%.
Completely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take it down to the bare bones and then build it back up again.
Definitely. Any songs that you can think of offhand that would be cool to do that
Because I'd like to hear them, because I'd like to hear maybe like Room at the Top, something that feels maybe a little unfinished or could be reworked and be completely different, Yeah, I mean, it's really hard because those songs are, it's almost sacrilege to do them in a different way.
Yeah.
When you do them, it's like when Jacob Dylan does The Waiting, you just play The Waiting, or when Jackson does The Waiting, you just play The Waiting. When we do them, we're not like, we've never done sort of the note for note thing. We don't, we just kind of play them the way we play them. But the songs are the songs. I mean, they are what they are.
Yeah.
The parts are the parts. You want to honor those. But I think it would be, and his catalog, as we get further and further away from his lifetime, it's a living and breathing thing that I think will be, it will be divorced from the Heartbreakers and the records.
Yeah. Okay.
Just
a quick note on that, though, and someone you've mentioned earlier, and again, who I've spoken to, and I'm a great admirer of, Jake Thistle. I think he's one of the very few people who I do think does a good job of taking the songs, keeping the sort of the spirit of them, but putting his own personality into them too. So like he'll play Room at the Top and he'll do it all on piano, or he'll do, he'll change it up just that little bit. And I think but he knows where the heart of the song is, and he never strays too far away from that, right? So you can do it. It's just difficult.
I played with him many times. I count Jake as a friend. I really like him as a guy. We did a songwriters thing not that long ago. Oh no, he was in the round robin before me. But anyway, a really, a huge talent and a great guy, and like a real fan. Yeah. which is
Yeah,
cool.
I've got huge hopes for him. He's one of those. He's like, please let him break through. Please and not get broken by the industry. I don't want the next Ed Sheeran. I know what Ed Sheeran can do. I want Jake Thistle sounding the way Jake Thistle sounds. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, what song do you most frequently recommend to people who don't know Tom's music? If someone says, "Well, I don't really know any Tom Petty. What should I listen to?" What's your go-to?
Nobody says that. I mean, nobody really says that in 2022.
It's a hypothetical.
Okay. I think the song that's all things to all people is I Won't Back Down. I open almost every acoustic show I do with I Won't Back Down.
Yeah.
Because even people who haven't heard it in 20 years, it gets them right away.
Yeah. I was going to ask about, I think I've written that down somewhere even actually. I've talked to a few people about this, and Tom Petty's one of the very few artists for me who, things get overplayed on radio. American Girl, I've heard that song a million times. I don't listen to Bohemian Rhapsody anymore because I love it, but I've heard it and it's in there. I don't listen to Stay Away anymore because it's in there, I know it. But American Girl comes on, I'm going to listen to it every time. Because it's just, there's something, again,
well,
something just
it doesn't
different.
overstay its welcome, though. The thing about those records is both of them are, I was just having this conversation with my, the guy who's mixing my new record, which features Ron Blair on it. We were making some edits, and he goes, "Oh, I see, we're making the songs longer." And that is a trap. The thing that Tom was always really good at doing was being a judicious editor. I mean, those songs, American Girl is less than 3 minutes. I Won't Back Down is probably 3 minutes.
Yeah, there's no fat on those records, right? There's anything that can be taken out that you don't need, get rid of it.
And there are things you would do naturally in the intro. You would think you would play the verse in the intro, but it's just the two passes.
Yeah.
And you go right into it. It's just like, anyway. Yeah.
Super, super cool. All right. So your last question.
How many more?
Just one more in the quickfire. Yeah, we're already done the quickfire. So describe Tom Petty in 3 words.
Stubborn. Right. Genius. And cantankerous.
Excellent. And there's a funny thing.
None of those things, by the way, for the people who are like, I can't call him cantankerous, I see that as a badge of honor.
and stubborn's not necessarily a negative. Stubborn can just mean strong-willed. It's synonymous with strong-willed, right? And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
All right, we've been 2 hours, and I feel like we could probably talk for another 2. And maybe what I'll have to do is get you back on sometime, and we'll talk some more about.
I'd love to. Well, my record will be coming out at some point in the probably early next year, so that'll be enough of a gap that we'll have things to talk about.
Perfect. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to wrap up here, but I want to just throw over quickly, and I know that you are touring constantly, or gigging constantly at least, and you have a new record coming out. You've got a new single that just dropped not that long ago, right? And people can find that on Apple and Spotify. What should people look out for? When are things coming up, and where can they find you online?
If you're in New York City, we're doing a Rolling Stone 60th anniversary show in August. We'll be doing our Tom Petty birthday shows in October, both in New York City and DC. And like you said, my version of Ronnie Lane's The Poacher, where I poached mostly Paul Weller's band to play on, is out. And there'll be more singles and a new record called Last Days of Summer. Hopefully, part of it is, I would have had it out already, but part of it is the supply chain. You can't get vinyl.
Yep.
It looks like maybe March or April, but I think I'm going to be in the UK in November to do some promo, and then we'll be doing a proper tour all over the place in March, April, May, throughout the summer next year. I already know 2023. It's crazy.
Fantastic. And if you're ever up this way, if you're ever close enough that I can swing by and get a gig, if you're in you probably won't be coming to Saskatchewan, but if you're ever in Alberta, Edmonton, or Calgary, I'll head out and I'll come say hi.
Beautiful up there. I hope we can. We'll come in the more less inclement weather. Yeah, I mean, I love the travel of the road. I'm not a traveler by nature, but I like being on the road. Yeah. It's weird. That's a weird thing, musicians. I'd rather be in the house, but I'd rather, but if you give me, I have a bag packed. I have a go bag. And if you said, I need you to do a gig in DC tonight, I could be on a train.
You're out the door.
I'm out the door.
That's funny.
That's the life of a itinerant musician. So yeah. Yeah.
I was
and
just
if people want to keep up on social media, Jeff Slate on Twitter and Instagram, Jeff Slate HQ on Facebook, and jeffslatehq.com on the interwebs.
And I will put in links to those for you
Can't
in
believe I
the
said
episode
interwebs.
notes. We're old. We can say interwebs now, and people, it's just charming now, right? When we say that. So.
No, it's not charming. Like
Dad jokes. Dad jokes. Okay. Hey, thanks so much, Jeff. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege meeting to you and chatting to you. And again, I hope at some point we'll get back on and do another one, or I hopefully see you in person.
Yeah, this time we should talk about Tom Petty, but okay.
Well, we got enough, and like I said, I can do some editing there. There's enough in there, I think. So it's good. But I always think that like talking to people about where they come from it's important to learn about who someone is to understand why they love Tom Petty so much, or how it sort of frames that relationship with the music, right? I always think, like, my daughter is 15 now, and 2 years ago she came to my wife and I and said, I want a record player for Christmas. Out of the blue, like, no, we don't. I didn't have one at that point. I had some vinyl kicking around, and obviously my vinyl on my walls. And so she said, I want this record player. I'm like, okay. So we got this record player. She had no records, and she bought herself the soundtrack to the Bohemian Rhapsody. Was the first one she bought, the movie. And then she bought her second album that she ever bought was Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers' Greatest Hits. And then the third album she ever bought was Abbey Road. So I was like, you know what? I think I've done okay here. I think I've done a reasonable job of she's my little rock and roller. So
I think the thing about Tom Petty that spoke to me as a young guy starting out, who clearly was going to take a path, that wasn't quote unquote normal, was that he had a real, like all the other people that we talked about over the last 2 hours, he had a real fuck you attitude.
Yeah, 100%.
This is he had an opinion. He knew he was right, and he was going to follow that to its logical conclusion, win, lose, or draw. Yeah. And I identified with that. I thought that was something. If I can't aspire to be as great a songwriter as him, I think to be true to yourself and follow whatever it is you believe in to the obvious conclusion. That's the way to live your life.